The Florida Historical Society presents Florida Frontiers is made possible in part by the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund and by
The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is in the O'Galley section of Melbourne, Florida. Preserved as it was in the early 20th century, historic tours of the Rossiter House include antiques, artifacts, and family heirlooms, and the 1865 Houston Family Cemetery. The last resident of the home was successful businesswoman and philanthropist Caroline P. Rossiter. The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is available for weddings and other special events.
Florida Frontiers is also sponsored in part by the State of Florida through the Division of Arts and Culture and the National Endowment for the Arts. Thomas Edison was an inventor and entrepreneur in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and his work has a lasting impact on our society and culture today. Welcome to Florida Frontiers, presented by the Florida Historical Society. I'm Ben Brotmarkle. Thomas Edison's many accomplishments include the creation of the first phonograph that could record and reproduce sound, development of the first practical incandescent light bulb, and the invention of a commercial motion picture camera and projector. From 1885 until his death in 1931, Thomas Edison spent his winters in Florida, living and working in Fort Myers.
Edison grew up in Milan, Ohio, and he moved to West Orange, New Jersey. He spent about 80% of his time there, and he was doing a lot of his research. He opened up 2 major laboratories there, his Menlo Park facility, and then when the Menlo Park facility became too small for his operations, he built a bigger laboratory in West Orange, so he was very involved with his work on the light bulb, and he had also developed the phonograph, which is the first device that could record and play back sound, which earned Edison the nickname the Wizard of Menlo Park.
There is a lot going on in Thomas Edison's life between 1884 and 1885. He's under a tremendous amount of stress at this juncture in his career. He had just lost his very first wife, Mary Stilwell, after 13 years of marriage. She passed away at the young age of 28. Thomas Edison himself is in his 30s, so a very young man. At this point, he's also raising 3 of his first children. He had 6 altogether, his first 3 children with Mary Stilwell. And he's involved in all these business ventures up in the American Northeast. So essentially all the stress that Thomas Edison has in his life begins to physically manifest itself through respiratory illnesses, pneumonia, hypertension. His personal physician encouraging Thomas Edison, please focus on your health. Travel somewhere where it's nice and warm. So Thomas Edison decides to travel down to St. Augustine, which in the 1880s, late 19th century is considered a playground for the rich and famous. So he arrives and he has this vision that it would be this nice, beautiful, sunny weather, very, very warm. Ends up being one of the chilliest winters St. Augustine's faced with, not to Thomas Edison's liking.
Edison came here. First, he came to Florida in 1885 for health reasons, and he was suffering from pneumonia, and his doctor told him to seek out a warmer climate in the wintertime, and that was in February 1885. And he was in St. Augustine. And when he was in St. Augustine, a friend of his by the name of Ezra Gilliland suggested that he come to South Florida, Fort Myers, to see the rich botanical landscape environment of this area.
So what he does is actually traverse the state of Florida, and he arrives at a place called Cedar Key, charters a schooner, travel down the western coastline of the state of Florida, and he arrives at a place called Punta Rasa, and he's staying at a hotel referred to as the Tarpon House. And the owner or proprietor of this establishment, George Schultz, who also runs the telegraph line. As a teenager, Thomas Edison was an expert telegrapher traveling to different cities. They had something in common.
At that time, Punta Rasa had a major telegraph station. It was the overseas underwater telegraph station, which incidentally that became later the Western Union Telegraph. And it was a very important telegraph station. It was the only telegraph station that connected Cuba with the United States. It was a major telegraph station. The manager of that station was a fellow by the name of George Schultz, who had also turned Buena Rasa into a hotel. And the hotel was for what we call snowbirds today, who came down for tarpon fishing, for the Silver King, the huge tarpon, which incidentally, Edison was very much involved in. He loved to fish for tarpon.
George Schultz informs Edison of a quaint little town about 11 miles up the Caloosahatchee River. So Edison, being the inquisitive man that he was, takes the trip, travels to Fort Myers, a very small town of 349 individuals, roughly 50 structures, and the primary industry was the cattle trade. So this literally was a cow town. Edison really liked this town and eventually decides to purchase land right next to the river, so riverfront property. Eventually buys 13 acres for $2,750.
Edison actually came down to Fort Myers that year, and within 24 hours, he came across this property and bought it from a local cattleman named Samuel Summerland. It was sold to him for $2,750, which at the time was a pretty good deal. And Samuel Summerland was a cattleman, and that really reflected what Fort Myers was at the time. It was a very small cattle town, only a few hundred residents. So Thomas Edison coming here, as influential as he was, really put Fort Myers on the map.
Thomas Edison called his recreational winter estate in Fort Myers Seminole Lodge. His time in Florida was not all for rest and relaxation, though. Edison built a working laboratory on his property.
Initially, when Edison arrived, he did see bamboo growing down by the riverfront. Now, the bamboo was brought in the 1840s by a different gentleman, but obviously bamboos, certain species are highly invasive, so they spread everywhere. Now, Edison, always being the inquisitive man that he was, decides maybe I can test the bamboo down here in Southwest Florida in secrecy away from New York City and New Jersey. And so a lot of his initial research was plant-based research here in Fort Myers.
He actually noticed bamboo growing by the Caloosahatchee River, and he actually had discovered that bamboo was a really good, sustainable filament for the light bulb that could last longer. It actually burned up to 500, 800 hours. So with bamboo, he was able to create a light bulb that could be commercially successful and not burn out, just after 3 to 4 seconds with previous light bulbs. So he did come here to work on some light bulb experiments, and the lab that he built in 1886, it was dedicated to his electrical experiments and was considered an electrical laboratory.
On his honeymoon in 1886 with his new bride, Mina Miller, he does work with telegraphy down here on their honeymoon. And so essentially he's working on a quadruplex. So it's a lot of ideas, a lot of initial sketches of his ideas and products, and then experimenting somewhat here in that original lab here in Fort Myers on that. He also did experiment a little bit with the phonoplex and some of the telephone technology as well.
He was working on myriad inventions. Edison considered himself an inventor, not a scientist. He was working on myriad inventions. And he opened a lab. The first lab was not where we're sitting today, the major lab. It's on the other side of McGregor Boulevard, which separates the two parts of the estate. And he was doing chemical experiments and looking for different chemicals that might work as conduits for electricity and so forth. And then he moved across the street, which McGregor Boulevard again, to where we are now, where we're sitting now. And he built a much larger lab.
Thomas Edison, Harvey Firestone, and Henry Ford came together and formed the Edison Botanical Research Corporation. Their main focus was finding a domestic source of rubber in the United States. It was following World War I, and all of America's rubber was imported at the time. So that's what Edison really focused on in his time here in the laboratory here in Fort Myers, and that was one of his final projects.
Thomas Edison, prolific inventor, one of the most prolific inventors the world's ever seen. He had 1,093 United States patents. He had 1,239 foreign patents in 35 separate countries. It's pretty amazing what he was able to accomplish. A lot of his patents pertaining to different fields such as electrical lighting, sound recording, motion pictures. Not a lot is being said of the fact that he actually created the first laboratory for true research and development in the United States.
So Edison really did have a great network of people around him. He utilized many staff and connections from across the world to help with his experiments. He actually would term the machinists or any of the staff that would work with him, he called them muckers. And even when he was working on his rubber research project here in Fort Myers, he had a total of 80 paid staff members as part of the project. So although Edison did not conduct all the day-to-day research, he definitely did utilize the expertise of the people around him, such as chemists, glassblowers, machinists, and he even had a secretary that would help him produce written documents of his research as well.
Thomas Edison welcomed other prominent people to visit him at his winter estate in Fort Myers. These included President-elect Herbert Hoover, writer and naturalist John Burroughs, tire manufacturer Harvey Firestone, and automobile maker Henry Ford. Before changing history by manufacturing affordable automobiles starting in 1908, Henry Ford worked for Thomas Edison in the 1890s. Edison and Ford became such good friends that in 1916, Ford bought his own winter estate right next door to Edison's.
The relationship actually begins in 1896. So Henry Ford is employed by the Detroit Edison Illuminating Company. He has the privilege of traveling with his immediate supervisor, Alexander Dow, up to the company convention in New York. On the third night of that convention, he meets his idol, his mentor, Thomas Edison, who, according to Henry Ford, gives him encouragement on his quadricycle, which was Henry Ford's first horseless carriage that he was employed on working with and trying to improve upon. So you fast forward to roughly about 1911, and Henry Ford begins to correspond with Thomas Edison, begins to write him in regards to knowing more about storage batteries, learning more about that technology. Perhaps they could collaborate together on an electric starter for their Model T, which they discussed, but it never really came to fruition on that.
Edison was working on even some of his inventions to help Ford. For example, a battery for the car. And then later in their careers, rubber experimentation, which took place right here at his lab in Fort Myers for tires, synthetic tires for Ford's automobiles and so forth. So they had a very good relationship, and it was not just professional but familial. The two families were very close as well.
Edison and Ford had a father-son-like relationship. Ford was actually 16 years younger than Edison, so Ford looked up to Edison for so many years. Edison was this well-known inventor who had more than 1,000 United States patents to his name, and Henry Ford was just in awe of Edison and, was really excited to, eventually be acquainted with the inventor after he got a job as an electrical engineer at the Detroit Edison Illuminating Company. He did very well. He started off as a nighttime engineer, ended up being promoted to chief engineer of the company, was invited to a company convention in 1896, where he did meet Edison in person for the first time. The convention was in New York. While Henry Ford was working for the company, he was also developing his first car.
Ford actually met Edison in the late 1890s, and he showed him what he was working on at the time, which was his first vehicle, the quadricycle. He showed it to Edison, and Edison really was taken by it and was like, "This is amazing, young man, keep going." He really encouraged Ford, and Ford looked up to Edison. There's a 16-year age gap between the two, and Edison, already being a very good businessman and inventor, Ford, who was going into that same type of field, really looked up to him. So eventually, when Edison started to vacation here, Ford came and visited him as well and stayed in the guest house. Next door lived Robert Smith, who was a New York businessman. He actually saw that Ford was coming to visit and decided to write him a letter, and it got received by Ford's sixth secretary, and they decided to buy the home. Robert Smith was offering it to him, and they ended up settling for $20,000. So he got the property, the Mangoes, right next door, and he was able to vacation with his very good friend, Thomas Edison.
When Ford and his wife Clara were here, Henry Ford, they would visit almost every evening. And they would engage in what would be the major recreational and entertainment event of their era, of their interest in that time period. And that was that Henry Ford and Clara Ford would move all the furniture in their living room and have a band, and they would engage in square dancing, which was the major entertainment of that area. I'm not sure the youth of today would find that all that recreational or entertaining, but that was the way the families often spent their evenings.
Now, they also did collaborate together with the Edison Botanic Research Corporation. So Henry Ford heavily financed that corporation, also provided Thomas Edison with a lot of research and resources as well. So what sort of started as just an acquaintance really truly blossomed into a very, very strong friendship, profound friendship between Thomas Edison and Henry Ford. Now, Thomas Edison was 16 years older than Henry Ford. So essentially, Henry Ford is looking up to Thomas Edison almost like a surrogate father and older brother. So he really, really, truly, deeply cares for the man, and was profoundly saddened when Thomas Edison passed away in 1931. So Henry Ford rarely returned here to Fort Myers, and by 1945, he does sell his property.
Henry Ford did work on projects here. I mean, he mainly came down here to spend time with Thomas Edison and to assist Edison with the rubber research. But after Edison passed away in 1931, Ford actually started experimenting with the V8 engine. He did have a garage on his side of the property attached to the caretaker's home. That garage was actually where he started testing the V8 engine in secret. Not many people knew about this project. Chevrolet had come out with a 6-cylinder engine, and Henry Ford wanted to compete and create something bigger and better. He actually did a test of these engines, and he had employees drive all the way from Michigan to Fort Myers. One of the cars was equipped with a V8 engine, and then he surrounded them with cars with a 4-cylinder engine to mask the noise of the V8 because, it wasn't really commercialized yet that he was producing this. But that was a project that he started working on in Fort Myers. And, employees from the Ford Motor Company came down here to assist him with that project.
Henry Ford developed an assembly line technique of mass production, which allowed him to manufacture affordable automobiles that became very popular.
Oldsmobile actually invented the moving assembly line, and then Henry Ford perfected it. So when he started working with the assembly line, it originally took about 13 and a half hours to get each vehicle off the line. Ford brought that timing down to 93 minutes. That brought the cost of Model T down from about $850 to as low as $260. So this was the first time an average American could afford a car, and it really opened up travel across the entire United States. It ushered in this era of what we call tin can tourism. So a lot of people started traveling to remote places across the United States that they could have never accessed before.
Henry Ford's assembly line was extremely important. I mean, it really, truly revolutionized manufacturing process here in America and beyond, had a global-wide impact. And basically what he does is take the labor to the workforce, okay? He begins to then have a very sort of disciplined and highly regimented system of production. And he begins to create interchangeable parts. So you have over 10,000 components or parts to the Model T. Everything's interchangeable. He simplifies everything.
Henry Ford recognized the hard work that his employees were giving to him on a day-to-day basis. He instituted the 8-hour workday, so employees were no longer working 12 to 14 hours a day. And he also did the $5 a wage per day.
So what he does is try to lower the instability of the workforce and the turnover there at his company. He's also trying to create a vested interest with his workers and more loyalty for the company. So the more successful they are, the harder the work, and the productivity will actually increase for the company as well. He also at the same time lowers the work shifts from 9 hours to 8-hour shifts, which was actually a fantastic idea. So now he had 3 8-hour shifts operating continuously throughout the day. 40-hour work week, okay, which made it better for his workers, but also increased productivity for his company as well.
Henry and Clara Ford spent less time in Florida annually than Thomas and Mina Edison. Mrs. Edison, in particular, became very active in the community.
Edison was much more dedicated and focused on his projects here on site, where Mina was much more involved with the community here at Fort Myers. In fact, in 1928, she creates what's called the Fort Myers Roundtable. She served as the very first president. She's working with all these prominent citizens here in Fort Myers. She's also working in conjunction with various civic-based organizations such as the Rotary Club, the Women's Community Club, the Plant Guild, among others as well, and really trying to create projects that would beautify the city itself, beautify the highways, clean up vacant lots, but she's also at the same time raising funds for the Red Cross. So she's very, very much involved here. The greatest gift that she gave the city of Fort Myers was the property itself to serve as a tribute to her late husband, Thomas Edison, and that occurs in 1947. She deeds it over for $1. And it's an amazing gift that's still essentially paying dividends today.
The area was a very small town. It was mainly for cattle, and so they really brought a lot of attention to Fort Myers. The Edisons were extremely famous. He was already a very established inventor when he started coming down here. So that alone really just pushed the economy of Fort Myers because people wanted to come to even just see the Edisons. On top of that, Mina was very involved in her community. She was in a part of various gardening societies. She had a very huge passion for gardens, as is reflected on the botanicals that we have here today on site. But that was one of the few things that she did in the area, as long as donating the property. She ended up selling the property to the city for only $1 because she wanted to donate it, just to push education about Edison and made sure his legacy lived on. And she wanted it to be exactly what it is today, a museum, and just sharing knowledge about his inventions and what they did here in Fort Myers.
Henry Ford purchases his property in 1916. He then sells the property in 1945 to a private family. That family then sells the entire property, close to 4 acres of land, to the city of Fort Myers in 1988. So they acquired it for $1.5 million. Henry Ford himself had acquired it for $20,000 fully furnished, sold it for $20,000, and mindset being, I do not want to profit off the death of a great, great friend. So that family then sold it to the city, who then opened it up to the general public in 1992. It was called the Mangoes because of all the mango trees that existed on the property at one point. So now we have this wonderful Mangoes Ford-related property adjacent to the Thomas Edison Historic Site.
Today, we are considered a botanical garden, and we do serve to continue the research Edison did on the property. Edison was focused on finding a natural source of rubber using botanicals on the property. He also used botanicals for his light bulb as well. So Edison really considered the plants here a living laboratory. And we really try to convey that today in our gardens. You know, we create a living garden here, and many of the historic trees Edison used in his research are still here today. And when we go and plant a tree, we really kind of keep in mind, what would have Edison planted here? What would he have wanted on the property? What trees would he be using for a specific project? So how can we carry on that mission as well as possible?
You have roughly 2,000 three-dimensional items on display inside of our world-class museum. We have our Edison Laboratory, which is considered a chemical landmark here in the state of Florida. We have close to 22 acres of lush tropical gardens and 11 historic structures, 9 of which are listed on the National Register of Historic Places in America.
The work of inventors and businessmen Thomas Edison and Henry Ford is still having a significant impact on our history and culture. The Florida homes and property where they lived and worked are preserved as the Edison and Ford Winter Estates in Fort Myers. You've been watching Florida Frontiers, presented by the Florida Historical Society. Visit us anytime online at myfloridahistory.org. Thanks for joining us. I'm Ben Brookmarkle. The Florida Historical Society presents Florida Frontiers is made possible in part by the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund and by
The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is in the O'Galley section of Melbourne, Florida. Preserved as it was in the early 20th century, historic tours of the Rossiter House include antiques, artifacts, and family heirlooms, and the 1865 Houston Family Cemetery. The last resident of the home was successful businesswoman and philanthropist Caroline P. Rossiter. The historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens is available for weddings and other special events.
Florida Frontiers is also sponsored in part by the State of Florida through the Division of Arts and Culture and the National Endowment for the Arts.